Good evening. My name is Galen Gissler. I'm a board member with the Pajarito Environmental Education Center and also a member of the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee. It is my privilege to welcome you this evening to this panel discussion, The Magic of the Pajarito Plateau, jointly presented by PEEC and the JROMC.
Now I'd like to introduce our panel for this evening. As Galen mentioned, the title of the panel is The Magic of the Pajarito Plateau. And our panelists will talk to you a little bit about how this plateau came to be and all the interesting things that drew Robert Oppenheimer to come to this area to vacation and ultimately to recommend it as a site for the Manhattan Project. Our panelists include Fraser Goff, who is a geologist with 38 years of experience studying the Jemez Mountains and the Valles Caldera in this area. Fraser knows more about the geology of this area than anyone else that I've ever met. We also have Gerald Martinez sitting next to Fraser. Gerald is a member of the San Ildefonso Pueblo and is descended from one of New Mexico's first families, Maria and Julian Martinez, whose pottery many of us have enjoyed looking at over the many years. Gerald recently retired from a 47-year career at the laboratory, and he will be talking about the culture and history of the plateau. Next, we have Ali Livesay, who is an archaeologist who specializes in the Southwest region. And she is going to be talking about the archaeology of the area as it relates to the cultural history. And lastly, we have Elliot Schultz, who is a historian of science at Los Alamos. And is also a former park ranger and has lots of insights about how history and science intersect in this area. So those are our panelists, and I hope you enjoy our discussion. Thank you.
Fraser, would you like to lead off?
Sure. Let's see if I can get all this hardware to work. Not trip over everything.
And I need to, yeah, there we go.
How is everybody? Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the geology of the Pajarito Plateau. And one of the bylines in some of the literature I got for this panel discussion was to say some things about the geology before the Manhattan Project. But of course, I have a query on it because, you know, the geology doesn't change that much before or after the Manhattan Project. Only what changes is our concepts and our notions about how it all behaves. So, and before I get into it, doesn't this, you know, this time with everything that's going on in Europe, a little reminiscent of what was going on in 1939? It's almost amazing that we're giving this presentation, this panel discussion at this momentous occasion. Next. Okay, before 1942, there was really not that much published on the geology of the Pajarito Plateau. In fact, I really did look around and I could find barely anything on it. So let's start at 1880, when Adolphe Bandelier was led to the Pajarito Plateau by a gentleman named Montoya, who was an elder at Cochiti Pueblo. And of course, Bandelier lends his name to the National Monument. He did a lot of work here, as did many others after him. In 1885, the Tewan Mountains, not the Jemez Mountains, were described by none other than John Wesley Powell. And he said that they erupted many types of volcanic rocks, including voluminous deposits of ash, quote, by which the heavens were filled with volcanic dust. Quite prophetic. In 1890, there was a project by a guy named Iddings who described some mineralogy, some alteration products of olivine in the Cerros del Rio basalt across the Rio Grande from us. And the samples were provided by Powell. I don't think Iddings ever came here. He just did some work on them back in Washington, D.C. In 1907, there was a very detailed description of the Rio Grande Valley by a guy named W.T. Lee. And Lee was the first person to recognize that the valleys of the Rio Grande stretching from Colorado all the way down towards Mexico were a series of interconnected north trending structural basins. But he didn't have the concept of a rift at that time. And in 1910, there was a very detailed description of the gold silver deposits at the Bland mining district south in the southeast Jemez by a guy named Lindgren. Next. So Los Alamos Boys School was established in 1918, started by Ashley Pond, 2 years after Bandler National Monument was established. So going on with our before 1942, there was a very comprehensive study of the fossils in the Espanola Basin starting in 1924. It went on for 40 years and was conducted by Frick at the American Museum of Natural History. And then finally, in 1931 and 1937 are the first abstracts, mind you, on the Valles Mountains Volcanic Center by Clarence Ross. Finally, something on volcanology. In 1940, the first comprehensive paper on the Santa Fe Formation. We now call that the Santa Fe Group, and it was published by Denny at Dartmouth. And so at the time of the Manhattan Project, field geology was conducted with boots, hammers, handlens, compass, horses, or Model A Ford. You know, topographic maps and air photos were pretty scarce. Microscopes were available at a few better institutions. X-ray diffraction was just in its infancy. And, you know, getting a chemical analysis of a rock was very, very, very dear. Of course, field geologists still use boots, hammers, hand lenses. Okay, so Oppenheimer and Groves chose remote Los Alamos in late 1942. And although some residents and scholars realized that the plateau is composed mostly of volcanic rocks, there were no models or detailed explanations of things like volcanic and tectonic lineaments. The Jemez lineament was named in 1958. No models for large caldera formation like the Valles, no models for large ash flow sheets like the Bandler Tuff. Those started in the 60s. There was no mention of intercontinental rift systems like the Rio Grande Rift. That began in the 70s. There was no concept in 1942 of continental drift, seafloor spreading, plate tectonics, modern geochronology, geophysics, and modern volcanology. So all that postdates 1942, frankly. Next. The Pajarito Plateau was chosen because it is rugged and remote. There were other reasons too, but this is one of them. And so this photograph is looking to the north across Pueblo Canyon, and it's looking in the general direction of Espanola. And if you look here, you can see the road that climbs up the north wall of Guaje Canyon. So quite a maze of canyons and mesas. Next. This photograph is looking west at the Sierra de los Valles, and we're looking up Pueblo Canyon. Here's the main hill road. Here is Los Alamos National Laboratory. Here's the town of Los Alamos. And this big break and slope between the mountains in back of Los Alamos and the plateau, that is the Pajarito Fault Zone, one of the biggest in the state. A fault zone that's still active. Of course, the lab is built right on it. Next. So let's kind of get into the modern times. And so this slide shows the regional and tectonic setting. And this dashed outline is the Rio Grande Rift. And crossing it is the Jemez lineament. Oops, sorry, one slide too far. The Jemez lineament is a alignment of volcanic centers that is Miocene to Quaternary in age. There's no age progression along the lineament. There is no compositional variation along the lineament. The lineament is not a hot spot. It's some kind of a deep structure in the earth, and it acts as a conduit for the eruption of magmas. And at the intersection of the lineament and the rift, you have the Jemez Mountains now, and in the center of it, Valles Caldera. And so EB is the Espanola Basin of the Rio Grande Rift. And the Pajarito Plateau is right in here. And so structurally, the Pajarito Plateau is actually within the Rio Grande Rift. Next. And so the first geologic map, if you will, showing the Pajarito Plateau was published by Smith et al. In 1970. And so I took a photograph of the eastern portion of it. The map really shows the entire Jemez volcanic field. And so just to get you oriented, Valles Caldera is on the left side of this blow up. Here's the Rio Grande. Pajarito Plateau is all in here. Town of Los Alamos National Laboratory. The Pajarito Fault Zone, I've mentioned. These black lines represent the Pajarito Fault Zone, one of the most active in the state. And so in back of Los Alamos to the west, we have the Sierra de los Valles, shown here in dark green, a series of volcanic domes and flows. In light green, we have something called the Puye Formation, named after the Puye Cliffs, obviously. And it is a volcaniclastic deposit. It is a series of coalesced alluvial fans. And the material from these fans is being shed off these volcanic domes, the Sierra de los Valles. The apple green is the Cerros del Rio basalt field, which is mostly on the east side of the Rio, but there's some exposures to the west. This pale color, this tan, is the Santa Fe group, not the formation. We call it the Santa Fe group now. And it is all the sedimentary rocks that fill the Rio Grande Rift. But the premier rock of the Pajarito Plateau is in orange. It is the Bandelier Tuff. It is the ash flow sequence that was erupted from Valles Caldera 1.25 million years ago. Next. So here's a little cross section across the Espanola Basin portion of the Rio Grande Rift. And on the east side, we have the Santa Fe Range, actually the Sangre de Cristo Range. This dark orange represents the volcanic rocks of the Jemez Mountains, includes Valles Caldera. The yellow is all this basin fill sedimentation that's going on in the rift. And it dips mostly to the west because the Pajarito Fault is the master fault of displacement. And so the thickness of fill, this low density sedimentary fill, is about 4,500 feet. We know that from seismic work. The depth to the crystalline basement is 3 to 3.5 kilometers. There's a lot of displacement along that fault. It's been active for a very long time. Oh, and right here, that's the Pajarito Plateau. It's structurally within the Rio Grande Rift, even though the volcanism is from the Jemez Mountains. Next. So how about a few photographs of some of these rocks instead of figures and word slides? This photo was taken near the Puye Cliffs. I'm looking to the west and the Rio Grande is behind me. And so here's our capping mesa of Bandelier Tuff with a date of 1.25 million years. Overlying this sequence of volcaniclastic alluvial fan deposits, the Puye Formation, which is being shed off the Sierra de los Valles. In a beautiful contact between the Puye and the Santa Fe group. And in this location, the Santa Fe is about 4 to 5 million years old. It looks different, it has a different dip. You can probably sense that. It has a different color, it's pinker. And so it's pretty easy to tell those two units apart. Next. Here's a photograph looking north of the Bandelier Tuff resting on the Cerros del Rio basalt. And so again, I'm looking north. This photograph was taken below the Y on New Mexico 502. Here's the basalt. Pretty standard, dark gray, olivine basalt, dated at 2.4 million. And in this place, we can see both of the Bandelier Tuffs. There's actually a lower Bandelier dated at 1.62 from the Toledo caldera, which predates the Valles. And then the upper Bandelier Tuff, the one that's so spectacularly orange, it's from the Valles caldera explosion at 1.25 million years ago. Next. Now we're looking west at the Sierra de los Valles, those volcanic domes in back of Los Alamos or west of Los Alamos. This photograph, you can see Pajarito Mountain, a ski area dated at 3 million. The Rendia Dome Complex is to the north. It's a pretty broad area of several coalesced domes. Most of them are around 5 million years old. Here's the gymnasium for the high school. And again, the break and slope between the plateau and the mountains is the Pajarito Fault Zone. Next. But again, the premier rock out here is the Bandler Tuff. And it's a sequence of pyroclastic flows. I'll talk about that in a second. It's arguably New Mexico's most famous rock. And I don't say that in jest because when I worked at the lab, I got numerous phone calls from foreign geologists, foreign volcanologists. They wanted to see the Bandler Tuff. They wanted to see the Valles Caldera. And when I got them out there, it was like I was taking them to Mecca. We now know that the emplacement velocity of the Bandler Tuff, when it was, flowing as pyroclastic flows, greater than 100 kilometers per hour. The emplacement temperature was nearly 500 degrees C, depending on where you were. And we now have a pretty good volume estimate, plus or minus 400 cubic kilometers. That's 95 cubic miles. Now, that's not the biggest pyroclastic flow sequence in the world, not by far, but doggone, isn't that beautiful? And it is so well exposed because of the incision on the Pajarito Plateau that you can see so much. In this photograph, we're looking to the east towards the Sangre de Cristo Range. We're looking over the Rio Grande Rift. Next. So what are pyroclastic flows? They're explosive mixtures of ash, pumice, rock fragments, crystals, and gas. And they flow downhill at high velocity from the eruption sites. And so on the left, here's a photo of a pyroclastic flow at Montserrat in the Caribbean, 1995, less than 5 cubic kilometers. And look at that cloud and look at these houses. I bet they're nervous. On the right is Pinatubo, 1991, 10 cubic kilometers. In the lower left, you can see this pickup truck. He's trying to get away. I don't know if he made it. Does anybody know? Anyway, that's 10 cubic kilometers. The Bandler Tuff is 40 times bigger than that. Give you a sense of scale. Next, and finally, the Bandler Tuff is probably most interesting to local archaeologists as a rock. I realize that the obsidian in the Jemez and some of the other pumice deposits are quite interesting as well. But the lower part of the Bandler Tuff is where all the archaeological action is. And it's pretty soft and it's easy to excavate, to make cavates and to hammer out blocks to make Pueblo constructions. And I'll just end by saying that isn't it interesting that Los Alamos National Laboratory and the city of Los Alamos is mostly constructed on the Bandler Tuff. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you for your attention. I guess, do we take questions now? If you want, maybe, maybe not.
Do we have any questions from the audience? And there are some in the chat, I think. No, there aren't any in the chat. Okay, right. Questions in the audience. Wendy.
So nowadays our fault zones.
Okay, so Wendy's question is, back in the 1940s when geology was in a much more primitive state, did the folks who established the laboratory here have any inkling that they were on a active fault zone?
Which is a great question. In the 1940s, there hadn't been a geologic map to show the continuity of the faults, but around 1920, there was a magnitude 6 earthquake in the town of Cerrillos on the other side of the rift. The fault actually crosses the rift south of the Pajarito Plateau. And so that earthquake was quite destructive. But I don't think they understood that it was a long fault zone that connected to the north. And perhaps there were small earthquakes felt during those times. I mean, we feel them today, of course, but I don't know if they put 2 and 2 together on that. That's a great question. Yeah.
Yes.
I couldn't find any information.
Repeating for Zoom. Sorry. So the question was, since Robert Oppenheimer had a wide variety of interests, including mineralogy, did he write anything about about what the geology of this area was? Or
So again, another good question. I could not find anything published by him on mineralogy, but I have to tell you that people who do mineralogy, they're really crystal chemists. They're not geologists, certainly not field geologists. So I think there's a disconnect. I often get asked questions, oh, you must know a lot about minerals. Well, actually I do. I have a degree in chemistry as well, but most geologists don't. And so there's kind of a separation of mineralogy and geology, certainly field geology.
okay, we do have a couple of questions coming in on the chat. One of them is, how many vertical feet of tuff exist below the town of Los Alamos?
Another great question. So beneath Los Alamos, probably about 300 to 500 feet, depending on where you are.
And on 502, just east of the intersection with New Mexico 4, about where the speed limit drops to 40, I often see folks parked and studying a rock layer. What are they looking for or looking at?
So yeah, another great question. I thought it was 45 actually, the speed limit, but what they're looking at, that is a place where there's wide turnouts. And so a lot of university geology departments stop in that area to look at that tuff sequence. So they're looking at the basalt. If you go low enough, you can see the Puya gravels beneath the basalt. And of course, they're looking at the Bandler tuff because that's a very nice exposure right along the highway where students can look at the tuff, perhaps collect samples of it, and so on. So that's a classic location.
No more questions from the chat. Are there any questions from the audience? Any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, let's give Fraser a round of applause. Thank you. And let's turn it over to Gerald Martinez.
Good evening. With respect by everybody up. My name is Gerald Martinez, coming from the Pueblo, San Ildefonso Pueblo. And I'm coming from my grandparents were, great-great-grandparents were Maria Martinez. She was well known for blackenware and pottery, but and Adam Martinez and Santana were the son and daughter-in-law. And the thing is, I worked here at the laboratory for 47 years, and I thought I would continue to 50, but there were so many grandkids that I had to pertain to that babysitter. So it changed my whole career, and I started. But overall, my grandmother, great-grandmother, Maria Martinez, lived next door to my father's house. So each morning, each day, we go talk to her, and she presents us an oral history. And she talked about how she was making her pottery and how she got her designs from the plateau, Pajarito Plateau. And she talked about the husband, Julian Martinez, did some excavations out in the plateau area, which was the Ottaway of Pueblo, down in the Pueblo of Canyon. So the other one was Sidige Bird Village. So that one, my great grandmother mentioned that they were bringing down, the husband was bringing down the pieces of artifacts, and she would copy those designs to put on her pottery. That's how she started doing that. And then they discovered a Vanu water serpent on the cliff face. And that's where she started putting the Avanu on her pottery. And she was well known and recognized for that Avanu on her pottery, a water serpent. So she talked about all these things. And then the son, Adam Martinez, started talking about the plateau up here. And he did a lot of hiking, traveling up here, did a lot of research, and did a lot of visit some of the answers that we have up here at the plateau. Most of all the canyons within our cliff faces, dwelling where our ancestors used to live. And then he used to travel the trails. In some of the areas we have traditional cultural property where our tribal members go up to visit those sites annually. So the whole thing is, it's beautiful out here. And I started listening to my grandfather and my grandfather, Adam, and he started working here at the laboratory, and he started seeing stuff, and so he came back to me and told me, he said, you guys, you need to go back and work for the public, for the laboratory, and find out what I'm talking to you about, this oral history. So I started, I put my application in, got accepted, and I started working here. And wow, it was amazing that whatever he presented to me as oral history was out here at the plateau. One of the sites were Nakimu village. That was that, a fantastic village where there's standing walls yet. And he talked about that. But most of all the time was Maria Martinez was really talking about all these things, how she met Oppenheimer and the wife, and they brought them down to the village. And there's a little Ottaway house down in the Rio Grande, but there's another site, they call it the Warner House. It's on the west side of the Rio Grande. It was kind of hidden away, and you can't really see it from 502 State Road 4. So that's where Oppenheimer was visiting Maria Martinez and most of all the families from the Pueblo that brought their artwork and all that to show to Oppenheimer. And they presented some dances there that performed to the Oppenheimer. So there was a little get together for the scientists that they were all up here, and they enjoyed food, the traditional food and all that. And then Oppenheimer invited my grandmother up here to Fuller Lodge and all these activities up here. And I said, wow, when I came up working up here, I started seeing Fuller Lodge. And well, that's what she was talking about, And so everywhere what she mentioned on her oral history was saying, wow, that's glad to really listen to an elder and to pinpoint all these areas, And I listened to my other grandfather, and he started walking the trails. And he started talking about Tancanwiga National Monument area. And so he was talking about all the calendar years that some of the projected to the caves and all that. And so many things, a lot of history back in there. And he talked about where our people used to meet, our man folks, and they talked about the oral history, what's happening. And they presented our Tewa language to the young generation that were coming up. And I said, whoa, and he talked about an area like a little valley, and there was one little precision, little plateau formation, and that's where the speaker was. And he was presenting all this stuff, the oral history, to the man folks in a little valley area. And when I went hunting, and I said, whoa, this is the same area that he was talking about. So it's a fantastic area, plateau, and where the biographs were presented, that one plateau was right on the west side of the Rio Grande. We call it the battleship. And there's a lot of traditional cultural property on top of that area too. And there's trails from there that leads all the way to, they call it Hamus Mountain, but they call it Tewa Mountain. And there's a trail that leads all the way to Valles Caldera, where they used to hike back there to get obsidian flakes for many usage of their traditional ways to help for our ways and our traditional activities and our dances that we perform to gather our herbs and all the things that we need to provide. But there is a lot of history up here at the plateau, and I believe I had an opportunity working for the lab. I traveled from Bandelier, Frijoles Canyon, all the way to Puye. That's on the Santa Clara boundary. But there's so many areas that are villages out there, amazing things that are out there. And But again, it's most of it, some of it bound by our boundary, Pueblo de San Alfonso. And there's limited area that we can have hikers in there. But it's a great view. You can see all this. And I wanted to stay on with the laboratory yet to hit 50, but to enjoy this nice scenic views and all these canyons and all these things before the fire came through. It's like, but and my grandfather, I don't know how he heard about the fault. And I said, whoa, this is like something, oral history goes back, I guess. Somehow maybe they figured some maybe shaking or something going on. I really don't know. But when I started working for some groups, they talked about all those things, Some of the scientists were going up here, studying about all those things. And it's like, wow, there's a lot of things going on. But overall, it's like a great place. And Oppenheimer really enjoyed the areas and our people. And like our annual feast days, January 23rd, and everybody's welcome to come some of the dances. And it's open. But now it's like we don't have no photographing going on because they found out way back in Europe, they started making money out of that, of our traditional dances. So we stopped that. But it's still open to our Pueblo. And we try to have dances up here, some of the plateaus too, but it's amazing how and I see some of my Maria Martinez pottery in museum, being here at the laboratory too, and seeing visiting some of the museum in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and I was like, wow, I seen her making those big pot water jars and huge, But one time, my late cousin and myself, she was making pots, and I don't know, we were playing, throwing rocks, and accidentally hit one. We broke one pot out there, and she really got after us. But I said, whoa, and good thing we didn't make any damages to those big, huge pots, It took like 2 years for her to put those designs on it. And it's amazing. And she talked about a lot of things up here, what was happening here at the laboratory. But I enjoy, being here. And I'm still working for the laboratory as a guest scientist here. But I'm still want to recruit some of our people, our next generation, our high school students, college students to come up here and work. It's a fantastic place, to work. It's an enjoyable place. And I enjoyed it. So that's why I stayed that long. So I guess I'm sort of like advocate now to recruit some of the students up here. And it's good that they have scholarships now. It's good to have the opportunity, which we didn't have that time. And we, I don't know how we survived, but we did. But it's a long time, we grew up with no electricity, kerosene lamps, no running water. We had wells and all that. And now the new generation, our grandkids tell, you're lucky. You got televisions, you get iPhones, all this game, and we didn't never have all that, But we tell them, enjoy, go up to the plateaus, the Pajarito, and enjoy those areas. And where I live on the west side, that their area is Pajarito Village. And there are still some scientists living in there. They retired, they bought some land in there, private land. So they enjoy and they introduce themselves too, and they're helpful too. They help some of the local generation get opportunity up here and all those things too, so. But I'm here tonight with respect of all the people and our people, but there are some information that I can't provide. It's kind of sensitive to us. We hold it back and they tell us that keep it in your heart, keep it in your brain, and the next generation you can perform and let them know about what happened. But there are some ties there, but it's a wonderful place for the laboratory to be here, and I enjoyed it. And I think Oppenheimer really enjoyed it living out here too. And I think that's why he kept on coming back and forth. But and plus there was a train down there too. I never seen it, but my grandmother and grandparents, they talked about that, and wish I was that time to ride the train, but it passed through our house right next to where I used to live. But my late parents passed on and gave us their traditional house, which was a 2-story house. And that's where I'm at the Pueblo right now and trying to help out all the kids out there, whomever. But that's it for tonight, I guess. But thank you for being here, and my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gerald. We appreciate that. There are a couple of questions on the chat. Let's see. So Gerald, does the San Ildefonso oral tradition have an explanation for how this area was formed, how the Pajarito Plateau was formed?
Yes, there is. Maria and the son, Adam Martinez, mentioned all those things, how it was formed, and they talked about all those things, that the ash and the pumice and everything layered all the areas, like what the first presenter did, and they talked about all that too. So there is the oral history about that.
And then there's another question. How was Councilman Timothy Martinez of San Ildefonso Pueblo involved in the project presentation? And did you learn from his guidance? As I'm sure he learned new scientific information. He was a great teacher as well. Many respects to Mr. Martinez.
Yes, he was a great spokesperson. Enjoyed his lectures, but he passed on with lengthy illness. It was just a shock to us, but he left a lot of memories of history, and he did a lot of presentation for the kids as our Tewa language program brought into our Pueblos, and he shared all the knowledge that he had. And so some of it's good that he did all those things, and he was, every opportunity that he had, he came up here to the laboratory and did some presentation here at the laboratory in the Plateau area. And he dedicates some of the trails with Tewa language names. So he is well known for all those things, But
well, we're very sorry that he wasn't here tonight, and convey our condolences to the Pueblo and to his family and so forth for the loss. But we very much appreciate that you stepped in at the last minute to
yes.
to contribute to this presentation. Are there any questions from the live audience? Yes, Beck. So the question is, are you able to convey some of the stories that Maria and Julian conveyed to you, to your grandchildren?
Yes, I am. And I'm teaching the Tewa language to them too, as they're growing up. And I say, this is what's happening. This is what your great-great-grandmother mentioned and your great-grandfather. So I've been passing all that information, and to all the other tribal generation also.
Good. Any other questions? Okay, let's thank him again. Now, Ali, it's your turn.
Sweet, thank you. All right. So going back, this area boasts about a really unique history. We have evidence for well over 5,500 years of human history, a few Paleo-Indian projectile points. Most of it is of the nearly 2,000 sites that LANL manages. About 73% of those are ancestral Pueblo. They are ancestral to Tewa and Keres speaking peoples. We actually share a border with San Ildefonso Pueblo, and so the cultural affinity and long histories that these people have with the Pajarito Plateau is very, very well established, both with the oral histories, with the archaeology, and that makes it really, really unique. I will also say that the Pajarito Plateau was not empty. It was never abandoned prior to Oppenheimer coming. So even though a lot of the Pueblo peoples that have been living up here in the 1150s on to about 1600, And then there was many periods of extended droughts. And so a lot of them moved down to the Rio Grande River where they could have permanent settlements. But they're still using the Pajarito Plateau for traditional cultural reasons, for ceremonies, for resource gatherings, and for hunting game and things as well. So never abandoned. And then, of course, we do have some homesteading sites, most of which are Hispanic in origin. They're people from the valley coming up here and doing cash crop, mainly beans. Beans do very, very well up here, especially with dry farming, which most of the Hispanic farmers and the earlier ancestral Pueblos are practicing dry farming, where they're relying on annual rainfall and then occasionally diverting water using gravel mulch techniques, or using the geology to create borders and retain water as much as possible. So ancestral Pueblos people were up here for a really long time. And part of it is because they have everything they wanted. They have the mesa tops, which are great for farming. There are water and sun and springs in the canyons. The resources for making stone tools, we have basalt and dacite, which is a nice knappable material, great for ground stone. We have, of course, Jemez obsidian. It's beautiful as it is sharp. There is some really wonderful chert called Pedernal chert, comes from Pedernal Peak. Really wonderful colors, very predictable napping. It's great to think that peoples of the past are not so different from us, and that the functional qualities are one of the reasons they chose things, but also the aesthetics. It's an absolutely gorgeous place to live. And Oppenheimer saw all of that. Of course, you guys have seen, maybe, or hopefully you've seen, the cave eights. Is one of the other really, really unique features that we have up here that count for a number of our archaeological sites. The bandolier tuff is pretty soft, and most of the ancestral peoples were targeting the area between the welded and unwelded, where it is really nice and soft, and excavating rooms out of that, and then oftentimes building masonry structures out in front of them. So we have the cave eights and we have masonry talus rooms out in front. Usually you can see the evidence of that either through foundations and corners of usually shaped tuff blocks in front. And then of course the viga holes across the top for the roof timbers coming out. A lot of these are in really excellent states of preservation, which is one of the reasons why we have so many sites to manage. And Oppenheimer and a lot of the scientists and families that were up here during the Manhattan Project really took advantage of the wonderful archaeological resources. If the laboratory wasn't here, earlier archaeologists such as Adolph Bandelier and J. Edgar Hewitt really wanted to make most of the Pajarito Plateau either part of Bandelier or a larger Pajarito Park, not just for its archaeological resources, but also its wildlife and the biodiversity of wildlife here. And so cave eights are one thing. We can document a really long period of history and of land use up here on the Pajarito Plateau. Most of the occupation is when people are settling down and actually starting to practice corn, using maize, corn, and beans and squash, the three sisters we like to call it. And they are early in about 1150 to 1300s. They're spread out more in the landscape. People are in smaller unit pueblos, 10 to 15 rooms. They have field houses if their fields are further away from the pueblos themselves. So that's during kind of what we consider the coalition period. Later, we get population influxes from the migrations from the Four Corners area, Mesa Verde and Chaco, and they're mixing with the people that are here, and they're forming these really large aggregated settlements. So Gerald talked about Sirigay and Odawi, and so those are some of the contemporaneous pueblos that people are living at on the mesa tops. Well, actually, Odawi is in the canyon bottom, but most of them are on mesa tops. So people are aggregating together. We're seeing a lot of different pottery types. There's people's fields are going to be further and further out. So we do see more of these 1 to 3 room kind of structures where people are living at seasonally in the summer for their fields. And those count for a lot of the archaeological sites. One of the things that I'll mention about the geology is that we can physically see how people are moving through the landscape. We have excellent trail systems. We literally can see the footprints that Gerald's ancestors left in the bedrock, right? So you look at any of the trails at Sankui and at Bandelier, and that is carved from people over and over again, walking and doing things on the landscape, visiting other Pueblo communities, hunting, going after game, collecting wild resources. And that's really, really unique. And you really don't find that too many other places. The geology really makes this a really beautiful place to live and to see past and ancestral places on the landscape. And then I'll take questions. That's kind of all I.
Thank you, Ali. So we have a couple of questions from the chat. What is the earliest human occupation in the area that we know of?
So we do have a couple of projectile points. I think we have some Clovis and maybe a Folsom. Really don't have any features in terms of, we just have single artifacts. Everything else has not been preserved. Occasionally, you'll see later archaic period when people are still kind of more mobile hunters and gatherers, but are starting to fiddle with and playing with horticulture and starting to domesticate maize. But those are just a few isolated ones. I would say most of the occupation intensity really starts picking up about 8600.
8600. With all of the volcanic rock, where did they find the clay for making pottery?
That's great. Clay, you're usually going to find that in the valley bottoms. There's a lot in the Rio Grande, and there's a lot that I'm sure Maria Martinez was able to pick up on Pueblo lands. But you're really going to want to look in the alluvial fills for a lot of the clay. And they also use the clay to plaster the inside of cave-8s too. So it's not just for pottery.
So they dragged it from the bottoms, from the river valleys.
Yeah, canyon bottoms, and even where there's some water moving through.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Referring to the three sisters, do we know if the ancestral Pueblo people grew summer squash, winter squash, or both?
Oh man, I know there was a study on some stuff on Forest Service land, and so I think there are a couple of squash variants, and there's as many as at that time. So it's not like modern corn; it's much smaller when they're domesticating it from teosinte to maize. But I think we have macrobotanical evidence that of the 4 variants that are pretty common in the Southwest, they're using all kind of 4 variants, and some are better than others, and in terms of sustainability and drought resistance. So they are using most of those. I think squash, there is a couple of different variants as well. We have pollen evidence for cotton and other wild resources that they're targeting, such as Chenopodium and amaranth. Pigweed and what's the name for? Yeah, Chenopodium. Chenopodium is it's a weedy annual that's they're using, even though they have maize. They are also still utilizing wild resources throughout the entire occupation up here.
Becky, did you say what that?
Oh, goosefoot. Yes, thank you so much. I couldn't remember the other common name for it, so I could only remember the scientific one.
Okay. And there's a question on animal migrations.
I don't know too much about animal migrations. I know that there was a decent amount of deforestation because of the long use of the mesa tops and probably overhunting. So I think, by the time Oppenheimer came in, there really wasn't a lot of like the bighorn sheep and the pronghorn and other things. I think there's still some deer, but the elk, also were being hunted pretty well.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? And yes, Natalie. The question is, the history of fire going all the way back to 600 AD, how frequently has fire been a part of this landscape?
So I think fire's been a part of the landscape for a long time. I don't know if it goes quite as far back as AD 600. I definitely know there's a lot in the 1300s to 1600s where there are fires about every 25 years or so. And we see that in the dendrochronology and the tree rings of some of the samples. Unfortunately, when the lab was built, they cut down a lot of the timber up here too. So we lost some of that data. yes, I think fires have been a part of this landscape for just about as long as it's been here. And it's something that the ancestral peoples were probably very adept at doing and handling. And they were probably also thinning and trying to create healthy forests and have indigenous fire management practices.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Thank you once again, Ali. That was wonderful. Now, Elliot, it's your turn.
All right, can you hear me? Perfect. So I guess really to talk about Los Alamos National Laboratory and the Manhattan Project and that ultimate question of why here, why then, and why is it still here? We really have to go back to about 1880 when Adolphe Bandelier came to Frijoles Canyon and present-day Bandelier National Monument. Through him and ultimately through Edgar Hewitt and sort of the realization of this landscape, there was a renewed sort of public interest in the greater Southwest. And with Hewitt, basically between 1906 to 1916, fought for the better part of a decade to make Bandelier and the surrounding archaeological areas into a national park. And that's really what sort of brought this broader interest in Los Alamos and the Rio Grande to a larger public, including Robert Oppenheimer, who eventually would move out to a ranch just immediately after high school. And because of that interest and because the federal government took a significant interest, especially after Ashley Pond had his ranch down in Pajarito Canyon and then eventually moved up into Boyce Ranch School. And there was a fair degree of exploitation of the natural resources. So in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the Santa Fe National Forest actually came in, and the clear majority of the land outside of the homesteading and traditional uses by the Pueblos was actually under control of the Santa Fe National Forest. So it was more or less public land at that point. So why specifically Los Alamos? And that really goes into that site selection for Project Y, for the Manhattan Project, where you really see the first time pretty much in human history, science actually becoming big. Up until that point, up until the beginning of the Second World War, a lot of scientific activities were usually done very piecemeal. They were done typically by small groups of people, either in universities or in many cases, independently wealthy individuals who just had the time, the money, and the resources to do that kind of work. But with the Second World War and just the speed and rapaciousness of activities that were going on in Europe and Asia at the time, there was, and that was also happening in the scientific world as well. There were just this incredible degree of discovery going on and a lot of latent potential as well. In 1937, that's when you have the discovery that the atom can be effectively split and you can produce an incredible amount of energy in nuclear fission. And then 3 years later, the scientists in the United Kingdom had come to realize that that energy could be harnessed either for systems of incredible power or of incredible destruction. And for the United States, who was still on the sidelines at that time, that was a huge concern, especially considering that you have major powers that are going at it that have access to this incredible knowledge and this incredible research. And so basically, as the United Kingdom started giving the United States more of its technical expertise, there was this push that we need to actually do something with this knowledge because there is a huge potential positive or negative for this kind of knowledge. And so for Robert Oppenheimer, when he was eventually brought on into the Manhattan Project in mid-1942, a lot of this research, especially in nuclear fission, was being done in more or less the same way that science had been done up until that point. It was being done by small groups of people in very isolated laboratories. There was a lot of replication of work. There was a lot of very good ideas, but not a lot of crosstalk. And so Oppenheimer availed to General Leslie Groves, who was the military head of the project at the time, that there needs to be a place where scientists can speak freely about this kind of research, but understanding the very serious implications of the work that they were doing, it needed to be in a place that was isolated. It needed to be in a place that would be secure. Because we have to remember at this time, especially in the 1940 early 1940s, we really didn't know the capabilities of Germany or Japan at that time. We didn't know whether or not they would be capable of attacking the continental United States. And so there was a huge concern of where are we going to put this facility where we have all these scientists working together on this incredibly powerful project. So it needed to be far away from coastlines. This laboratory needed to be relatively close to rail lines, talking about the rail line just right across the Rio Grande, the Chile line. It needed to be in a place where you could have reasonable access to power and water. And there was that unofficial sort of fourth qualification. It needed to be in a place that was pretty. Especially when you're considering that when you read oral histories of scientists that were working during the Manhattan Project, it was not outside of the realm where working 12 to 16-hour days, in some cases up to 6 days a week, was kind of the norm. And so having a place that was beautiful, having a place that you could go and just enjoy and relax after doing this kind of grueling scientific work day in and day out for the better part of 27 months, that was really important. And so, as has already been discussed, their first stop was actually Jemez Springs. But when they went through Jemez Springs, Oppenheimer realized it was a bit too narrow. It was not going to be as secure as they had hoped. There wasn't also a really good view of the surrounding mountains. And Oppenheimer was one of those people that was really interested in making sure that the scientists and the staff members who were going to be working here, they had that kind of aesthetic so they could enjoy themselves while they were working on this incredibly stressful project. The other major consideration from moving from Jemez Springs to Los Alamos, and it's already been talked about in other pieces and parts, is the settlement that was already here. In particular, the homesteading from the Hispanics that were in the area. There were about, as near as makes no difference, about 36 homesteads spread throughout the Pajarito Plateau. And there was also the Boys Ranch School, where Fuller Lodge and Bathtub Row, those facilities as well. And when we're talking about the Manhattan Project at these very early portions in late 1942, October, November, December, the general idea is that the project only needs a small, almost token amount of staff, somewhere between 200 to 500 technicians. So they need those technicians, they need the support staff, and well, we already have the infrastructure here with the homesteading communities. We already have a lot of infrastructure with the Boys Ranch School. We might just need to add a couple of houses, and that should be fine. And that's more or less how things operated in 1943, when Project Y was fully established in early April, up until about July of 1944, when the realization from a lot of experimenting that was being done with plutonium. So there are two separate elements that are being investigated during the Manhattan Project. You have uranium, which would be eventually used in the Little Boy gun type bomb. And then you have plutonium, which was going to be used in another gun type bomb called Thin Man, up until this point, at which scientists who were working on plutonium realized that it wasn't going to work in Thin Man. And that led to a major crisis in the laboratory, and when science got properly big in the Manhattan Project. And when I mean big, there was a doubling of population of about every 9 months or so. So you went from a population of about 500 staff members to about 6,000 technicians, more or less, working in the laboratory. And then goodness knows how many others were just in the community itself, rapid amounts of construction, and it's led to a housing crisis, which more or less has pretty much lasted up until the present day. In fact, I think it's starting to get a little bit worse than what it used to be. But with that, it led to this, I can't think of superlative appropriate enough for what it led to in terms of a transformation in the landscape. I guess unprecedented is probably the best way to describe it, because up until this point, with the ancestral Puebloan communities and with the Spanish land grants, and then eventually with the homesteads, there was always access to these sites. There were always access to traditional areas. There was always seasonal access for farming and ranching and timbering. And then once the military came through with Project Y, those ways of life and those patterns effectively stopped, because the operational requirements of Project Y and the security that was necessary for it pretty much dictated that that landscape more or less had to be sealed off. And it's led to this very interesting historical break. It's kind of unusual, speaking as a historian. A lot of things tend to happen in gradients. And this is one that there was a very physical break between existing land use and then modern day, and that pretty much happened in April of 1943. It's very rare to see those kinds of very stark contrasts, but with that contrast, it led to, like I said, a pretty significant transformation of the landscape, and also a facility that I would scarcely think to say has done more to change the geopolitical landscape of the last 75 years than just about pretty much anywhere else on the planet. I know there's quite a bit more I can talk about, but I would like to sort of pause with two quotes, paraphrase, not direct, but as to why people come here and why people stay here. The first of which is Evelyn Fry, who lived down in Frijoles Canyon at Bandelier National Monument. Her son basically said, "Mom, don't ever leave Frijoles. It's a beautiful place." And the other was Robert Oppenheimer, who said, "My two greatest loves are physics and New Mexico, and it's my dream to combine the two."
Thank you. Thank you, Elliot. Let's see, we have one question from the chat. Do we know how good or bad was the relationship between scientists and local Puebloans and Hispanic settlers during the Manhattan Project?
That's a very good question. And unfortunately, I don't have a particularly good answer. Gerald, Ali, would you happen to have any contributions to that?
I mean, I know we have historical photos of scientists and an Oppenheimer visiting the Pueblo and seeing dances and seeing ceremonies. But Gerald would probably know more.
There was a good relationship with the scientists up here with the Pueblos, and they, like I mentioned, they have their traditional dances up here too, the small version. So and other Pueblos were coming up here too to show their respect and all that too, for their own reasons to come up here to show their own traditional dances also to the scientists, you know. So they enjoyed it too. So it was a joint effort until a certain period, you know. So.
Right. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
I have a question about.
Okay, this question is speculative on counterfactual. And let me try to get the gist of it because it's a little bit complicated. So would you care to speculate on what would have happened had Los Alamos in particular not been chosen? for the Manhattan Project, given that there were a number of enterprises that were going on in the valley and so forth that were sort of doomed to failure, and what consequences would we have in the world today if some other place had been chosen?
That's a very good question. And actually, that's one I've never really sort of entertained before. I mean, obviously, the United States, considering its interest in nuclear energy, it would have developed a laboratory of similar scope, probably somewhere else, as to specifically where it would probably still be east of the Rocky Mountains, but as to where that would particularly be, I have absolutely no idea. In terms of the landscape itself, that is really quite interesting. Obviously, Bandelier National Monument would still remain and still be a pretty major factor. The Santa Fe National Forest would still have a considerable amount of land in the area. In fact, one of the significant reasons why Project Y was located where it was here in Los Alamos was outside of the homesteads that were throughout present-day Los Alamos. The clear majority of the landscape, at least administratively, was controlled by the Forest Service. And so it was more or less a matter of administrative transfer between the War Department and the U.S. Department of Agriculture as to how that would be managed sort of without the laboratory being here. Unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer for that, but it's a really fascinating question to think of. What would be the landscape today if they were not here? I mean, one of the biggest reasons why the Santa Fe National Forest and Bandelier were established to begin with was there was a significant impetus from the community of Santa Fe to actually develop these areas into national parks and federally managed lands, predominantly for tourism value. And so I think there would probably be still a considerable amount of interest in the landscape, and it would be more focused on the geology. It would be more focused on the ancestral Pueblo communities. I think you would see a lot more development along those lines than definitely what you have seen over the last 75 years.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple more questions that, in fact, these can kind of go together. What pueblos surround and contributed land to the war effort? And what happened to the 30 to 40 homesteads? Were they purchased, appropriated, or what?
That is a great question. The Los Alamos National Laboratory, specifically DOE, has accord agreements with 4 of the pueblos. So you have Jemez Pueblo to the west, Cochi to the south, San Ildefonso Pueblo to the east, and then the northeast, Santa Clara Pueblo. And so more than likely, there would be a lot of these would still be in the lands would still be retained by the ancestral, the descendant communities of the ancestral Pueblo, so the current modern Pueblo communities. The homestead question is really interesting because most of them were bought or purchased through condemnation. Interestingly, of the 36, most of those are Hispanic families that were homesteading up here seasonally. And they were not compensated equal to their Anglo neighbors. In fact, it was close to 1/8 compensation. Yes, pretty bad. Some of them were able to receive additional amounts in like 1943 and 1945 through civil suits. And then in early 2000s, there was a large settlement that was split between all the living descendants of the 36 families. And I think it was about $10 million to be shared. And then one of the outcomes that came out of this was a requirement to have a historical context that tells the stories of the Hispanic homesteaders up here. And so Ellen McGee and Dorothy Horde and Judy Machen have a really great kind of overview of those families as a historic context. And that was one of the other parts of the settlement. And interestingly, we did the most recent excavation that we have done was in 2019, and it was finishing the V Hill and Montoya homestead. And we happened to meet the great grandson of the Montoyas. There's 2 owners. and worked with him. He's actually an archaeologist and is now up here working at the laboratory with us. But he connected us to both his family, the Montoyas, and the previous owner, the Montespi Hills. And so we did some oral histories as part of the documentation for that as well. So descendant communities are really important. It's really important to work with them when we're doing archaeology, because the oral history and the memories that are embedded in the landscape are also very important for us as we're dealing with the displacement that occurred up here and acknowledging that.
That's great that you guys are keeping track of all of that and preserving that for the future. So geologically, in terms of plutonium, where is the runoff affecting the most, and what significant efforts are being made to return the area in better shape than it was?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I should have an answer for that, but I don't, because I really didn't work on environmental projects. I was lucky enough, I suppose, to have done a lot of work overseas and other states on volcanology and geothermal energy. So the environmental aspect I didn't work on so much.
Does anybody else have an Elliot or Ali or?
I mean, I don't know plutonium especially. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have any particular information regarding that as well. The only knowledge I know about any kind of plutonium experimentation, at least in regards to the environment, actually didn't involve plutonium at all during the Manhattan Project. And that's a couple of structures that are actually part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. Those were designed more or less when they were doing the sort of lead up to the Trinity test in July of 1945. And at that point, they were essentially going to commit half of the world supply of plutonium to an as of that point unproven scientific experiment. And it was a lot of resources. It was a lot of money to commit on more or less an unproven design. And so one of the big questions and concerns that was prevalent on everybody's mind is, what happens if we set this Trinity gadget off and it doesn't work? How do we recover the plutonium? And so there are a couple of structures. There's one, if you look on Google Maps and you go into Los Alamos National Laboratory, it looks like a giant dish or an upside down UFO. And it's known as the concrete bowl. And it's a testament to, especially at the later stages of 1944 and early 1945, no idea is off the table, especially when things are so close to the end and tensions are so high. And so there were a lot of tests that were done, basically placing explosive devices in more or less giant tanks of water and then seeing where the water dispersal would go. And it was significant enough that they actually committed resources to building a giant basin that is about 200 feet in diameter to really test the principle out. By the time that they actually were starting to do the test, most of the major physics and most of the major engineering on the implosion design had been essentially completed. And the scientists, as they were getting ready for Trinity, were reasonably confident that the efforts that they were doing for this kind of containment weren't going to be necessary. But in terms of any sort of modern plutonium usage at the laboratory, I cannot speak to that.
Thanks, Elliot. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there that could be dug into more. A few more questions from the chat. What is being contributed to preserve these ancestral areas, and how will they continue to be protected?
That's a great question. So generally, as a cultural resource management team, we try to avoid those archaeological sites and not have any types of adverse impacts to them. As the mission changes and as we're needing more space and developing more parts of the laboratory, it becomes harder and harder to do. But in general, we're trying to not have any impacts to those. one of the other things that we're really trying to focus on is education and outreach. And that means educating our own workforce, educating everyone in the community about how to be good stewards and help us in our efforts to preserve these landscapes for the future.
This is a fun question. What does a day of in the life of an archaeologist at the laboratory look like? Is it magical?
You know what? It is very magical, although there's some days that I'm like, wow, I'm getting paid to do this. It's pretty wild. It's been a little difficult during COVID, but luckily we've been able to still do field work. So sometimes I'm out flagging sites for avoidance for projects or performing walkdowns and making sure we're not going to impact a site. A lot of our work right now is focused on finishing the last little bit of survey of the laboratory, where we are trying to still identify sites in landscape that haven't been previously recorded and recording those sites, and also making sure that we have eligibility determinations through the National Historic Preservation Act to preserve those in perpetuity. So yes, it's quite magical. I am very, very lucky to be up here. It is totally a dream job. I think I can speak for Gerald and Elliot as well on that.
Thank you. Yeah, here's a clarification. There's no plutonium runoff. The only significant runoff is hexavalent chromium. So, and of course, we've all heard about the chromium plume that goes underneath our town, and county council has been talking about it, and they've had consultants come in and talk about it. Do you guys have any thing to say about hexavalent chromium?
That's N3B now. We can pass the puck.
Okay, all right, N3B. What originally brought Oppenheimer to this area? Why did he come to New Mexico in the first place?
I think he came because he did a school field trip into the Sangre de Cristos and really fell in love with the landscape, but Elliot is a much better storyteller than I am.
So it was a combination of that, and also for sanitary reasons, for health reasons. Immediately after graduating high school, he had contracted tuberculosis, and because of his experience in the Southwest, decided to set up at a ranch just outside of Santa Fe to recover. It's kind of amazing to think of a person coming from New York City, traveling via rail to a landscape that admittedly he has experienced before, but more or less to a ranch sight unseen at age 18. But Oppenheimer was always one of those very driven individuals, and when he had a passion, he would pursue it, and he had very many passions throughout his life, and it was because of that passion that's how he got introduced to New Mexico firmly. And like I said before, you know, it was a great day for him to be able to merge two of his passions together.
Any questions from the audience? Yes. So the question is, this is the road, Pajarito Road, which is now closed to the public, passes right by the pueblo that was mentioned by Gerald Chirege, and people used to be able to go visit that, so the question is, will that ever happen again? Will that road be ever open so people can go visit Chirege again? The pueblo, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. You know, we have in the past had Earth Day events and other things out there. It's a fine balancing act to make sure that tourists and people visiting are not impacting the site. And at one point we were asked to give the ancestors a break. They are still inhabiting those places, and just like other parks, there's always rest periods. Like Bandelier has rest periods for Sonkowe and for Bandelier. It's a great tool to teach people and to show people, and it's really amazing to be out there, and you really get the sense of, okay, this is why you have archaeologists, this is why there's so many of you, and this is why what we're doing to protect these places. So it is kind of finding that balance. With COVID, I'm not sure. The next steps coming out of the pandemic are going to be making sure we get the descendant communities access to those places and reconnect those ties for their ancestors. But I sure hope so. But I'm sorry, I can't give you a definite answer of like, yes, it's going to happen, okay. Because we all love seeing people out there and experiencing those places, and it's quite a joy for us as well.
Thanks, Ali. So there are a few more questions in the chat. This is nominally supposed to go till 8:30. I think it's almost there. Shall we just keep going? How do people feel about Carrying on? Yeah, we'll carry on. How did the scientists spend their time off, and how did the wives of the scientists, since most were men, contribute or do?
So most of the time that was spent not at the laboratory was essentially just going out and enjoying the landscape. There were organized hiking expeditions. There were a lot of expeditions going up into the Jemez Mountains at that time, typically escorted by the military during the winter. They actually developed the first ski hill. There's a really funny anecdote about George Kistiakowski, who would eventually be the head of the explosives division, who would be in charge of the implosion effort with the Fat Man bomb, being one of the high explosives experts in the nation. He actually carved out some of the original ski trails for the community by blowing up trees along the landscape to actually carve out the paths. Along with that, there were a lot of visits down to Edith Warner's house near Ottawee Bridge by the Rio Grande. Very, very infrequently, but still frequent enough that they would go down to Santa Fe and sometimes down to Albuquerque on very special, incredibly highly regulated trips. In terms of how spouses typically managed life during the Manhattan Project, it was incredibly variable, but if there was sort of one overarching word or description I could use, it was dull. Because it was originally designed to be a military post. It was and the community just sort of developed as sort of an organic outgrowth of that. It was a lot of this push and pull between military expediency and the fact that the great majority of the scientists that were working there were civilian, and it was a source of actually a substantial amount of friction when Project Y was initially established. General Groves, being the military head of the Manhattan Engineer District, absolutely insisted that all of the scientists be members of the military, either as enlisted or commissioned officers. But it was a considerable fraction of the scientific community that actually railed against that. And that's when you have this development of what would be the original contract operated by the University of California was emerged as that outgrowth, because a lot of the scientists that were working at Project Y believed that if it was a military run operation, it would lead to a stifling of scientific thought and inquiry. And as a part of that civilian outgrowth, that's why you had families that were moving up into this area. And there was this, once again, this huge push and pull that really wouldn't start emerging into what you could even call sort of Los Alamos as a community up until like the late 1940s, early 1950s.
Okay, we have a comment here. Sandra says the Y site lab worked 6 days a week. Friday night was time for relaxing and partying. Sunday was for family outdoor recreation. They also had the ranch school horses to ride. Right.
That's true.
Okay, got a couple more questions and then we're supposed to wrap up. Did Oppenheimer own land here in New Mexico before the Manhattan Project started?
He did. Do you remember the ranch name that he had?
I don't
in the
remember.
Sangres?
I don't remember specifically what the.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So say that name again. Perro Caliente. Hot dog.
I think it's fairly close to Roe Mesa, or was.
In the Pecos.
In the Pecos, yeah. Yeah, Pecos Canyon.
Okay.
And I think he owned it with his brother, and his parents would come out and visit a lot as well.
Okay, to the geology. What is the future? Is it? Okay, two questions actually. Is the volcanic activity in the area over, or will the Pajarito Plateau be converted to only mesas and canyons and ultimately the caldera rim? Just go to the valley, or could new eruptions or uplift build up a new plateau and it all starts over again? What's going to happen?
Well, that's a long question. So volcanology, the last eruption in the Jemez Mountains occurred about 70,000 years ago, and it is a glass flow in the southern part of the caldera. The caldera is actually a giant volcano with lots of little volcanoes in it. So there's been an eruption since the Valles explosion, about one every 25,000 years, something like this. So you could say that based on statistics, we're overdue for an eruption, but because, you know, volcanic eruptions are anything but perfectly periodic, we don't really know when the next eruption would happen. It could happen. There's a lot of heat down there still. We know that from seismic work and from the geothermal developments. But here's the deal. You know, those eruptions at Mount St. Helens and the one at Pinatubo, you know, they were preceded by a lot of earthquakes for 2 months before they actually exploded. So I like to tell people, if you start to feel the earthquakes, it's time to sell your house.
Will anybody buy your house? Okay. Were any children born during the project? Was there a school?
In short, yes. And when we talk about consternation with General Groves, I think that was probably the biggest consternation, was the fact that families were happening here at Project Y, because Groves really just wanted this to be a military base. He just wanted the work done. But when you have families together and you have husbands and wives together, families are inevitably going to happen.
Yep.
And so, yes, they basically had to build an entire community from scratch. They had to build a school. They had to build a hospital with a maternity ward. They had to build libraries. They had to build all of the amenities that were necessary for a town. And that just added to the additional complications and stress of the construction that was already going on just with the sheer expansion of the laboratory, especially after July of 1944.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct. Tony Oppenheimer was born here as well.
Oppenheimer's daughter was born here, is the comment, right? Okay, I think that wraps it up. I see smiles from our operators back in the back. Thank you very much, Fraser, Gerald, Ali, and Elliot. You've been a wonderful panel. Thank you very much, the audience who are present here.